Chapter 24. You Win. The next day it rained hard, and all that remained of the fire were a hillside of glistening black stumps, occasional sharp cracks, wispy smoke, and an acrid smell. Bob slept until noon, then arose groggily, gulped a cup of coffee, and drove to town to see about the lumber and millwork for an addition to the chicken house. He planned to brood 2,500 baby chicks in the spring, which would give us, even with heavy culling of the old flock, 2,000 laying hens the following fall. He also planned to buy a cow, scheduled to come fresh in March, 100 baby turkeys, and 5 young pigs. He was also going to see a farmer in the West Valley who had a light plant for sale. Our future prospects were very good, but my enthusiasm was at a low ebb. I was overtired by the fire and insufficient sleep, and even the magic words, electric lights, couldn't dispel the gloom in my outlook. My life on the ranch had reached some sort of climax, and it was the aftermath, which worried me. We were just about to go into another long, dreary winter, and I felt harried and uncertain, as though I were boarding a steamer with no passport and no luggage. I was leaning on the drain board of the sink, staring moodily out of the window at the driving rain and drooling eave troughs when a figure in a long billowing white dress and without a coat or hat came loping into the yard. My reactions were delayed that day, for I pensively watched while this odd person galloped through the rustic gate, her long dress flapping wetly at her legs, dashed over to the cherry tree, picked up a wooden duck of Anne's, cuddled it to her bosom, and began dancing around and around the cherry tree. Suddenly I came to. Something was not right. That woman had a shorn head and was obviously crazy. "This is all I need," I remember thinking frantically. "This finishes it." I knew that there was not a lock on the house which would keep this woman out if she made up her mind she wanted to come in. I was so frightened that I was probably right on a mental plane with my visitor. All the blood had drained from my body with a rush, leaving me perfectly flaccid. I thought, I must lock the doors. That will give me time. I got to the kitchen door somehow and locked it. The kitchen door had one of those ridiculous locks, which is a small black box with a tiny lever on the top. An angleworm could have forced it. My fumblings at the back door attracted the woman's attention, and she came running across the yard, crab fashion, and peered in the kitchen window. Her eyes rolled in her head like marbles, and she laughed wildly as she hurried from window to window playing peekaboo with me. I was leaning on the stove, whimpering. What will I do? What will I do? When I remembered the open screenless window in the baby's room where she was taking a nap. I grabbed the stove lifter and started for the baby's room, which was across the living room on the other side of the house. I couldn't hurry. I felt as if I were wading in water up to my waist. It took every ounce of strength I could muster to push one foot ahead of the other. When I finally reached the baby's room, the woman was there already, her head and shoulders in the open window. I brandished the lifter, feebly croaking, "Get out of here! Go away!" She stopped rolling her eyes and laughed and looked at me. Her face crumpled. She looked as if she were going to cry. Then slowly she retreated from the window, turned and went loping off down through the orchard toward the kettles. I watched until she had rounded the first bend in the road. Then I sank weakly down on the bed and thought, now I'm going to have hysterics. I'm going to explode just like a skyrocket. But the baby awoke then, and in the adorable way of babies, was overjoyed at seeing me, and jabbered, and held out her arms. And that was that. Bob came home an hour or so later. and he had new magazines and cigarettes and candy and a truckload of lumber. He was bubbling over with ideas and plans for the ranch, and so I waited until after supper to tell him about the crazy woman. I didn't even try to convey my terror because I knew by then that Bob and I were poles apart as far as emotions were concerned. I knew before I had finished the story what he would say, and he said it. "Why didn't you get a gun? Always remember that with a loaded gun in your hands, you have the upper hand of anything." That was true for Bob, but not for me. With a loaded gun in my hands, the gun had the upper hand, and besides, if you are the kind of person who grabs a stove lifter instead of a gun when danger is at hand, you are that kind of person and you have to face it. After supper, Bob and Ann and I drove to the Kettles to find out if they had seen the crazy woman. Mrs. Kettle was not at all perturbed. She said, "Oh, she was here this afternoon. She's the loony sister of a woman down in the West Valley. Mostly she's shut up in an institute, but whenever they can save the money, they have her over for a visit. She won't hurt nobody. She's just loony." "Where is she now?" Bob asked. "Why, she's down at the Larson's farm," Mrs. Kettle said. "They phoned for the sheriff and will probably send her back to the institute." "Oh, root-a-toot, a root-a-toot. We are the girls of the institute," Bob sang as we drove home. I thought, that Valley woman must be even more isolated than I, if she's that desperate for companionship. The next morning, the storm had increased in tempo, and there were pools on the floor beneath the open windows, and the rain had oozed under the doors during the night. The baby's washing festooned the kitchen once more, and Stove had its back up and refused to digest the fuel and became constipated with ashes. Swathed in oilskins, Bob began work on the new kitchen house. After I'd finished the lunch dishes and put my baby down for her nap, I donned my rain clothes and went to help him. I peeled strangers and measured 2x4s. I ran and got the hammer, the saw, the level, the rule. I was more skilled than last year, but I had lost all of my drive. Bob said, "Would you like to start splitting the shakes for the roof?" I love to split shakes, and ordinarily I would have been enthusiastic, but all I could manage then was a weary, "All right." At dinner, Bob shattered all precedent by suggesting that we drive to town to a movie. He said he had asked Max Jefferson to stay with the baby, so we hurried with the dinner dishes and the chores, dressed, stoked the fire, and then sat down to wait. When 15 minutes had elapsed, we realized that we would have to see the second feature anyway. So, took off our coats, and Bob lit us each a cigarette. We sat and smoked, and were self-conscious with each other. Bob studied the burnt end of the match he had used for cigarettes, turning it around slowly in his lean brown fingers. I watched him, and the clock ticked off the minutes. "Do you think he's coming?" I asked at last. "Oh, he'll be along," Bob said, not looking at me. I thought, heavens, we act like neighbors who suddenly find themselves in a hotel bedroom together. The clock ticked on. Bob said, "Did you order those hinges?" I said, "Oh, I forgot," and jumped up guiltily and started for the cupboard where we kept the catalogs. Bob said, "Don't bother now," and got up and put his cigarette in the stove. I came back and sat down. Bob was poking aimlessly at the fire, his back still toward me. I lit another cigarette and reflected. Husband and wife, teamwork is just fine, except when it reaches a point where the husband is more conscious of the weight his wife's shoulder carries than of the shoulder itself. I said, "I don't think that Jeff is coming." Bob said, "I guess not," and sat down and lit another cigarette. The clock ticked on after a while, and we went to bed. October eased out, and November slid into its place. We got up in the morning to the persistent, steady thumping of rain on the roof, and we lay in bed at night and listened to the persistent, steady thumping of rain on the roof. On Saturday, I went to town, but when I came home, I knew it would be the last time that winter, driving so many, many miles in the cold and rain in a truck, was too hard on the baby. Winter had come again, but there was no excitement in the knowledge, no visions of exhilarating battles with piling snows, no shutting out of a roaring blizzard, no sudden dramatic changes in the weather. It was the regular, gradual closing in of the mountains with rain, 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 moaning winds, and loneliness. Just before Christmas, Bob made an unexplained trip to Seattle. He was gone 3 days. The second day I ran out of kerosene, and we had the worst storm the mountains could manage on such short notice. The wind screamed around the house like a banshee. The trees beat their breasts and moaned. And the night threw her musty cape over us at a little after 4 in the afternoon. I lit the candles, which sputtered feebly, poked up the stove, put the baby on the floor beside Sport, and went out to do the chores. The animals all seemed apprehensive and hinted broadly that they would prefer to spend the night in the house with me, but I was firm and fed and watered them. Then bolted their various houses and barns against the wicked wind. When I returned to the house, bedraggled and dripping, I found that the back door had blown open, the candles had blown out, and the baby was howling. With trembling hands, I relit the candles, poked up stove, and fixed the dinner. At 5:30 sharp, we were all in bed. In the same bed, Anne and I under the covers at the top. Sport, the puppy, and the kittens at the bottom. I left the candles lit, although it was hard to choose between being burned alive and being scared to death. The next morning dawned, at last gray and wild. Bob came home at 3, looking and smelling deliciously urban. He was so cheery that I hesitated about telling him that I had again forgotten to order kerosene, and in the ensuing excitement, I forgot all about it, and we spent another evening by meager candlelight. Bob had news. Wonderful news, which he told me as he changed his clothes. He had gone to Seattle on the advice of the town baker to look at a chicken ranch which was for sale. He hadn't said anything to me because he didn't want to disappoint me if the ranch had proved a poor buy. But it hadn't. The buildings were sound and well built. Although in need of repairs and paint, the price was stiff, but not unreasonable. And the house was modern. In addition to that, the town banker had a buyer for our place, one with cash. The storm continued, the candles blew out, the stove remained lukewarm, but I didn't even notice. I coasted around the house, propelled by visions of linoleum floors, bathtubs, electric stoves, and flushing toilets. It seemed to me that from now on life was going to be pure joy. After dinner, we sat at the kitchen table, and by the light of the sputtering candles, figured assets and liabilities. At least Bob did. I was busy figuring how many hours a day I would save by having modern conveniences. I said to Bob, I suppose that with lights in the chicken houses and running water and things, we wouldn't have to get up until about 7 or 7:30. Bob was busy figuring. He said, Huh? I repeated, I imagine that with lights and running water in the chicken houses, we wouldn't have to get up until about 7 or 7:30. Oh, that won't make any difference, Bob said. Chickens have to be fed anyway, and the earlier you feed them, the sooner they start to lay. Which just goes to show that a man in the chicken business is not his own boss at all. The hen is the boss. The end.